about a minute to let everybody file in. It takes a little bit of time. Okay, everyone. We're going to start. There'll be more people filing in, but let me start off and just say welcome to everybody to the Wednesday sessions at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We have, since April, had a session pretty much actually every Wednesday afternoon to talk about conflict drivers in the United States and go deep, to not only just get into the talking points or that 30,000 piece where we talk about it, but actually get down into what is actually driving conflict and instability in the United States. And more importantly, what do we do about it? What is the practical approach that implementing partners that are working already on the ground, policymakers, donors, and as I say it repeatedly, if it's not funded, people can't do it. So that's a really important piece of this work. Okay, so we have a discussion today on peace building and education. We have some really great speakers here who are doing incredible work, both internationally and domestically. Patricia Schaefer from New Gen Peacebuilders, and Kate English. And sorry, Kate, I forget what your acronym is. Kate, what is it?
It's EIHR, which is Educators Institute for Human Rights.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I got that right. So two incredible members of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we're really excited to have them here. So let me start off and just talk a little bit about this subject, because in theory, this subject should actually not be that hard. Who doesn't want peace building education in curriculum? We should be making sure that we create or that ensure that in the United States, there is an incredibly well-educated population. I mean, that is a real cornerstone of democracy. And when Patricia and I started talking about this actually many years ago now, and we've talked about peace building and education overseas, we do this all the time. You'd be hard pressed to find a country where international programming is not working in schools, putting in peace building education, conflict prevention education programs. Again, really hard pressed not to find it. But why don't we do this in the United States? And there's a number of challenges. One, because our curriculum is so packed, and there's standards of learning. Kids have to take tests to make sure they pass them. And we hear repeatedly, we just don't have time to teach it. Coupled with the fact, when you go into some of the schools, and I find in schools in much wealthier areas, there's not a problem there. We don't need this here. So I think there's a bit of a denial, and coupled with the fact so much is piled on teachers already. But we do have statistics that show when teachers do teach peace building in their schools, in their curriculum, you see conflict go down. And there's been some studies out of, and some work done out of Columbia Teachers College that shows this. However, there is a real pushback. That was just in general. Now, not too long ago, we've started to see an incredible pushback and how this, teaching peace building, opening up the aperture on our history curriculum. We need to put money back into civics programs, civics teaching, because so much has been cut throughout the years. We're starting to see this really weaponized and politicized. And one could say it's a driver of conflict in the United States now and a symptom. And it's becoming hard to tell which is which. Is it a driver or a symptom? But it's really contributing now to the conflict dynamics in the United States. So The AFP and its partners, we've been working on this issue for a long time and trying to push this forward, because it's one place we know all Americans sit. They sit in high school. And especially with history curriculum, it's the one place that they need to have at least 1 year of instruction of history. So, once again, we know that education can be a driver of conflict that fuels grievances, xenophobia, and other misinformation, where education can contribute to peace building. So that's what this conversation is about. And we have two incredible members here who are doing that, working to promote peace building in the United States education system. So I'm going to let Patricia take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Liz. And hello, everybody. Liz said you have some nice presenters here today. What I love about this series that the Alliance for Peace Building has been running is it's consistent, it's ongoing, it happens on a regular basis. It's really a conversation, a giant conversation. And I jokingly said, oh, how many registrants do we have today? 3? Just joking. And the answer was, no, well, more than 100. Which actually to me is a really good sign, because it says we all care deeply, are curious about, and want to trade ideas and trade lessons learned and trade best practices when it comes to peace education. My role today is really to share with you a little bit about how I am doing it, or how the team members I am working with are doing it, or how the organization I head as New Gen Peace Builders is doing it, because it's not uncommon to hear we want peace, or peace is a universal value, that it's a value that has been reinforced and aspired to for millennia. But what is different is this question of how to actually educate for peace, and educate for peace on scale. I say on scale because I can't help but remember, and especially with International Peace Day coming up, that the notion of a culture of peace, that first phraseology that came out of the United Nations, has been around for more than 20 years. And the underpinning of that idea is that to have a culture of peace, and one that is sustainable, you have to educate for it. Now, I know in the work that I do in New Gen Peace Builders, but also with my connections with the Alliance for Peace Building, as well as the partnerships that I work upon with the Institute for Economics and Peace, that even though people want to jump to how do you teach peace, we always have to take a step back and say, why? Why do we need to teach peace? So I want to show you a little 90-second video, maybe slightly more than 90 seconds, that I retrieved from the ye old archives that we keep. And it's not that old. This video was made in 2018, when International Alert posted a report that was done with 100,000 people in 15 countries around the world, that asked, when asked what governments should spend more on to promote peace, where should they concentrate their spending? And so this little 90-second video, which is a summary of that very extensive report, offered some surprising ideas, only 4 of them, for both countries, cities, communities that find themselves in intense conflict, but also for those who aren't in intense conflict, but don't necessarily say, hey, we've cracked the code on peace. What should they focus on? So let's take a look at it. Okay, so I don't know about you, I am a big believer in the wisdom of crowds. The idea that if you can put enough perspectives together on a large scale, you start to see patterns, you start to see threads. And when you get a diversity of views and opinions together, you really do start to see what are the underpinnings of what you should do. So the fact that there was this poll taken with 100,000 people across 15 countries, and when asked what government should spend on for peace, one of the circled red items was teach peace in schools. I think that's a great indicator for us to all take seriously. Of course, the question becomes, well, so what does that mean to teach peace in schools? So I want to show you a slide that I used just a couple months ago with 12 teachers that are in a seminar that I'm leading with the Charlotte Teachers Institute. And so what I asked them to do was really explore a number of documents and frameworks that define peace education and see where they gravitated to, see where these various documents and informed sources kind of had a common thread, a red thread. And what's interesting is it was sort of eye-opening for them. It was an epiphany that to talk about peace education really means talking about various takes on peace education. So what is policy? What is planning? What's the pedagogy? How do you practice it? Or what's the practice of teaching? And how does it actually feed personal development? In other words, whatever is taught, how does it develop young people into civically minded citizens and adults who care about things like human rights, reducing violence, minimizing war, sustainable development? That's the question. And the participants, the players in this conversation are administration, counselors, classroom teachers, and oh my goodness, let's not forget our communities, because our communities are part of the education circle or context or construct. So as the teachers and I worked together, what we really began to see was that on a daily basis, they are working on personal development. They are working on sharing a value system with the young people who are being raised in the United States, since we're talking about the US working group. But what they often feel missing or want more of is frameworks and tools that they can use to have very thoughtful conversations with students, critical problem-solving conversations around how do we do the things that we all aspire to do, and the things that we just noted are related to peace. So I want to kind of show you how we've been going about it, because often I get the question, not just what is peace and how do you teach peace or what do you teach, but how do you go about it and how do you know you're actually having a positive impact on young people? So let me show you this next slide. All right, so here's what we've been doing. As Liz said, I am the executive director of New Gen Peacebuilders, which is a nonprofit devoted to peace education, training, and mentoring. I am also, as I said, a partner to the Institute for Economics and Peace, a very credible and much admired research and think tank organization that's doing global work, and lots of good work here in the United States, and the connection to Alliance for Peacebuilding. But through New Gen Peacebuilders, what we basically did starting 8 years ago, and with great enthusiasm and collaboration and support from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and Liz in particular, was take a framework that actually teaches young people, takes them through workshop experiences to learn the fundamental drivers of conflict and peace, to begin to work with frameworks and tools that help them look at tough issues in their own communities that they care about, coaches and trains them to actually guide peace projects based on ideas that they come up with, execute the peace projects, and then have to report the results to communities. So you can see all these various places where over the past 8 years, we have done that with New Gen Peacebuilders. But what's been interesting is as we have done all of this work with students in an extracurricular way, we've discovered that teachers themselves wanted access to the community, to the tools, the frameworks, the dialogues, the resources, so that they could use them, as Liz said, to broaden their lens, broaden their perspective on how they teach what they're already teaching, and how they could have more powerful, engaging conversations with students so that students could become really good agents of positive peace in their communities. And the secret that they saw was, how do you take learning and turn it into projects? And as many of you know, There are many requirements in many states across the United States right now that young people be involved in service, meaningful service projects. It's even become a kind of a university standard when you're applying for university. What I want to say about this framework or this way of teaching these principles is that we've been able to vet and demonstrate that the constructs hold wherever you go in the US, wherever you go outside the US. And what changes is the issues that people want to work on, that young people want to work on and teachers want to work on. They all relate back to that slide. It somehow is about being better agents for human rights and equality, and egalitarianism and economic opportunity, but they're context specific. So let me show you something about what's happened out of testing and vetting and piloting those experiences in all these different places in the last 8 years. We have discovered that there are, for us, there are really 4 go-to frameworks that I almost never do without. So if we're working with teachers or we're working with students or we're working with community members who, by the way, want to become more knowledgeable and informed about peace so that they can be positive influencers with schools that they care about and support the local community level, there are 4 go-to frameworks that we have found just translate so beautifully around the world and are very compelling here in the United States. One is the classic Galton's triangle. How do you actually teach young people that there are different types of violence, how to recognize those types of violence, distinguish amongst them, and begin to think about what are the types of violence that I want to minimize in my community. Another is a classic. It's the conflict tree. How do you help young people? And that means through teachers or in an extracurricular way, look at any situation, any topic, and start to analyze. What do I see? What's the core of the problem? And what are the root causes? What's underneath it? And it doesn't matter what topic you choose, this framework can be used. The third is the 8 pillars of peace from the Institute for Economics and Peace. These are 8 pillars that the Institute for Economics and Peace vetted over 4,000 data sets around the world that propose these are 8 elements that if you work on enhancing these elements, you can actually enhance peacefulness and resilience in your society. We found that we have been able to work with teachers and students to use these 8 pillars very powerfully to analyze what's going on in their communities, but also what they're teaching. And then the last is the Unleash process, which is a United Nations innovation model that was developed by Deloitte Consulting, actually. And it really helps any participants understand, boy, here's the problem. How do I frame it, describe it? How do I come up with an idea that could address it? How do I test it? How do I prototype it? How do I go do it? So we find that if we use these 4 frameworks over and over again, you can put almost anything through these frameworks and look at and wrestle with some really tough issues. Now, what does that mean in terms of what comes out on the other side, so to speak? In a moment, I'm going to show you, or I'm going to let you hear from Matt Brady, who is an alum of our program. But when you listen to Matt, what I'd like you to listen to is whether it is a teacher teaching English, or a teacher teaching AP history, or a teacher teaching global politics, or a teacher teaching dance, we have found that they can take whatever they teach and put it through these lenses to have students engage in conversations about those principles that you saw at the beginning. Of course, for everyone, the ultimate aim is to raise students who are more powerful peace builders. So here's what Matt has had to say about not just his learning journey, but how he has sustained it. And that's what we see with students over and over again when they work with teachers who have these skills and tools available to them.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to speak to you all today as part of this awesome celebration. My name is Matt Grady, and I'm currently a graduating senior at South Mecklenburg High School and will be attending Brown University this fall. I originally participated in the New Gen Peace Builders program as part of the spring 2018 cohort, but have since returned as both an ambassador and peace project mentor for the past 2 years. As a participant in 2018, I worked in a team of 10 students from across CMS to address the structural inequities in our education system. Realizing the striking disparities between access to SAT and ACT prep within Title I schools, my team worked together to craft an in-depth policy paper calling for greater funding to combat this issue. We presented our policy to the CMS School Board for consideration in the fiscal budget and rallied behind guaranteeing all students a chance at success. However, during my time as a New Gen Peace Builder, I learned so much more than just how to execute a peace project. Utilizing tools like Galtung's triangle and active listening within our work taught me the true value in analyzing conflict holistically. While conducting our peace project, New Gen taught me how a true peace builder always places compassion at the front of our work and works with rather than for a community. Since completing the program in 2018, I've returned as an ambassador and student mentor for the past 2 years. Last year, I led an incredible group of students who were inspired to address the Venezuelan hunger crisis. And this year, I was lucky enough to return and lead an amazing group of young peace builders in the College and Career Readiness Project that I'm sure you all will be able to hear more about later. I will also be interning with New Gen Peace Builders this summer and leading our youth advocacy efforts for global peace education. By harnessing the skills and experience I gained from New Gen, I was able to repeat the peace in a variety of ways. This past summer, I interned with the ECHO Foundation, where I crafted a human rights-based curriculum for over 20 CMS schools. And currently, I'm finishing out my term on the UNICEF National Council, where I serve as one of 10 youth leaders for UNICEF USA. But greater than all of these is the personal impact New Gen has had on my life. By teaching me that even as a high schooler, I can make an impact on the community around me, I've been empowered to take an active role in building a more equitable, peaceful world. My future goals all stem from the ways in which New Gen taught me to believe in myself as a leader, and is why I hope to pursue a career in international relations, so that I can continue the work toward crafting a better future for us all. And that's the note that I hope to leave with all of the newly certified New Gen Peace Builders today. Understand that while our cohort is coming to a close, your journey as a peace builder has only just begun. Everyone here should know that you are not a victim of your own circumstances, but rather, you all are the exact group of young peace builders most qualified to lead the charge for a better tomorrow. I hope you all continue to be proud of all of the amazing work you've accomplished with New Gen. Your efforts certainly inspired me, and I hope it inspires you too. Thank you.
So thanks for the extra few seconds to let that run, Megan and Alliance for Peacebuilding. Obviously, I want to turn it back to Liz and or over to Kate English, and I know you'll have some juicy questions later.
Thank you, Patricia. I loved what he said. Your journey as a peace builder is just beginning. And more importantly, it's putting peace into action. It's not just learning about it in terms of theory, but how do you put it into action and think about it critically and actually, make a community better, contribute to it. And that I think is, it's one of the reasons why I love your program. There's many reasons, but that's one of them. Okay, Kate, we want to hear from you again, some of the challenges, but also, why is teaching peace and opening the aperture on this work getting so politicized or weaponized? What can we do about it? And tell me a little bit about your programs and what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Liz. And Patricia, thank you for an outstanding presentation. I think you're going to see that that we have a lot in common. There's one particular common thread that will be evident shortly. At the heart of the work that we do at EIHR is this idea that we're teachers learning from one another. And that's, when we started off, and if you want to just go ahead to the next slide, Megan, just so the title slide's great, but I'm going to give you one of these text-heavy slides with my apologies. It was the best way to get the information across quickly. But you'll notice that at the heart of our mission, we're teacher to teacher. We learn from one another about what works best in our particular contexts, our classrooms, our communities, that we can approach with rigor and with fact-based information. And this has meant that for us, we've been able to look at other settings where teachers, classrooms, districts, governments have become factionalized about what happens in classrooms. And of course, we're starting to see that here. And I believe that's part of what Liz was alluding to in her introduction. So we are focused on the origin story for us is that a large number of our staff were trained at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as Holocaust educators here in the US. And that brought with it a number of established best practices going back through the 1970s and now reflected in the guidelines that you can find on the USHMM website, but also writ large globally through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, who just in 2019 came out with a whole new set of guidelines. And that for each of these teachers that we work with, that we partner with together, there's an exponential impact. So, for each teacher, in the US, you might have each classroom being between 20, 25, even 30 students. And if you're meeting 4 or 5 class periods a day, you can do the math as we get each teacher involved. It's how many students are we reaching year after year after year. So we're looking for that exponential impact by working directly with teachers. And we view teachers sort of as the shore that the tide comes in on, that the waves of students come and then they go, and they come and then they go. But the teachers remain as part of the community and part of the educational force moving forward. We work also with other NGOs and educational stakeholders everywhere we go. We prefer to allow others to take the lead to do their needs assessment, do an assets-based assessment as well, to really think about where they are and what they want to see happen next. Our values, we value collaboration very highly. We also value integrity. And that would go to creating safe spaces, having transparency in our work, and that our work focuses on facts, on truth, on those things which are indisputable. And in the end, and recognition of what teachers bring to their communities, their role and value as educators in lifting communities, but also in having a voice in the broader culture of NGOs and nonprofits and governments around the world, having a seat at the table in all of these dialogues. So we believe in creating a more peaceful future through education at the heart of what we do. We know that teachers in different settings have experienced, particularly because we're in post-conflict settings, that they've experienced their own trauma and sense of isolation. One of the more moving things that we've seen occur that we couldn't have predicted is that when we run a workshop, for example, in Cambodia or in Rwanda on Holocaust education, there's a recognition of the fact that they were not alone, that their culture isn't the only culture that's confronted something as horrible as a genocide. And that can bring with it some degree of comfort. And then when teachers are able to communicate together, well, how did you deal with this aspect of a post-conflict setting, building towards sustainable peace? And we find that that recognition of themselves in their partner teacher makes a profound impact. If we could go to the next slide, please, Megan. So similarly to what we heard from Patricia, we also have frameworks that we have built upon in looking at how we approach the content specifically. We look at the foundation of good education, whether it's in English or in history, which tend to be the subject areas where we address this the most, but of course applicable to other settings. But the foundations of really examining the history, we look at making sure we're clear on our terms and definitions. We use timelines frequently. We put things into context using maps and photo and document analysis generally, as we've used tools from the National Archives on that document analysis and photo analysis, although that's an ever expanding. We've also been working with photojournalists, which I'll speak to in just a moment. But when we're looking at post-conflict settings, there are 2 key things we want to bear in mind, that there are things that we can learn from patterns to make positive change. So that breadth of commonalities, that place where the teacher sees themselves in another teacher in a different setting, where can we hit on those commonalities in a way that's going to bring about positive change and sustainable peace? So we want to make sure that we're addressing those things. What we want to stay away from is the pitfalls that come from, making comparisons of pain and competing suffering narratives, which just are destructive forces. So we are very clear that when we're looking at those comparisons, it's for the purpose of positive change. Where we want to look at uniqueness and go into great depth is in this understanding and applying the respect for each history, whether it's someone's personal story of their experience, the unique factors that lead up to, that occur within and in the aftermath of an atrocity or a genocide. That there are lots of differences to be respected and honored. And so we want, as part of that idea of the integrity being one of our values, that we're sure that we're appreciating the uniqueness of each situation. And within those three central ideas, we also have some key principles. We do go back to those International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance guidelines and recommendations. They are fairly transferable to other settings. Of course, you would drill down and get specific on some of those as well. We are partial to understanding by design as a curriculum design tool. It's not the only thing we look at, but we like looking at essential questions and working backwards to think about how we get students to, how we accommodate student learning with those essential questions in mind. We have an emphasis on trauma-informed teaching, not only for students, but also for teachers. And we are about to embark on some research with one of our board members at George Mason University to really look at how trauma-informed teaching not only can impact the health and well-being of students in the classroom, but teachers who may be confronting unique settings. If you're in a classroom where the perpetrators of a mass atrocity, they're the parents of the students in your room, that presents some unique challenges. And how can we support teachers? How can teachers support one another in dealing with those issues? And then finally, this is the common thread we were speaking of earlier. We do really appreciate the Institute for Economics and Peace, and particularly the Positive Peace Index that Patricia was speaking of. What we particularly appreciate about it goes back to what I was speaking of earlier, that's data-based. And as Patricia pointed out, the IEP has over 10 years of data that they can go to. And so I think one of the issues, Liz, that I know that I have heard, and so a lot of what you're going to hear from me might be classroom anecdotal, or from my personal experience as 18 years as an educator, or what I've heard from other teachers who are currently or have very recently left the classroom. So I think that there's a perception, I don't know if it comes from a hangover from the 60s, if you will. I didn't mean hangover, I meant crossover from the 60s, but maybe hangover is a perfectly appropriate word. But the idea that seeking peace is somehow a soft pursuit. And what I appreciate about the IEP is that they've got definitive data backing up what they're talking about. So it's just another illustration of these 8 pillars that they look at to determine how countries are making progress toward positive peace. And of course, the idea of positive peace has been around for a while, but for teachers, sometimes it's a new thing to be talking about with students. The idea that peace isn't simply the absence of war. So what does it mean truly to be peaceful? And so we have worked with several educators to go through the IEP ambassadors program. So several of our international teachers have already met that credential, and they bring that to the trainings that they engage in internationally as well, which I believe Patricia had also alluded to. Just as a side note, if you wanted to learn more about all of this that both Patricia and I have been talking about with the IEP, the Positive Peace Report photo there in the slide is actually linked to the most current report. And we could go ahead to the next slide, please. Thanks, Megan. This is a map of where our current projects are. So when you see these different locations, you can see that there are plenty of places where we could look to situations where education has become factionalized, and lessons that we have learned from our coworkers, our co-teachers in all of these different locations. Now, some of the projects are more, they're piloting projects. So DRC, Colombia, Northern Ireland, and Lebanon are all things that are on the horizon where we're developing projects. But the projects that we've been doing in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda are long established. And the teachers that we have on our team and as part of our network can speak to this idea of, how do you deal with that factionalization occurring in your country? Where do we look to where there has been success? So I would say that the biggest thing that I would see as being helpful is if the government has some sense of unity about what it is that we're teaching. And I think that's where we are in crisis right now, is that we're seeing the division in the United States over what it is that we should be teaching in classrooms. If you look at Cambodia, the Documentation Center in Cambodia created a curriculum on the history of the DK regime in partnership with the Ministry of Youth Education and Sport. That is the textbook that goes out to every classroom that is the narrative history of those events. And then if you look in Rwanda, they had a recent complete refresh of their educational programming countrywide that looks at innovation, looks at good best practices in education overall, and includes histories of genocide, the Holocaust, and atrocity as part of what's required in all classrooms. If we look particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and even in this particular moment, we see that factionalization creates intense challenges. We have been working on a book, a manual called Holocaust Lessons for Peace, and it's been created by teachers in Bosnia for other teachers in Bosnia and in the region and globally, speaking about Holocaust education as a way to talk about the past and the future in ways that perhaps up until, well, and still recently, but hopefully it's changing given events this weekend, that they can talk about the events that they need to talk about in their classrooms. Often we have found that teachers can discuss Holocaust education when they can't discuss their own history. So with that in mind, the manual was based on being able to have a dialogue around the Holocaust history and being able to think about how do we come out of that experience, being able to build better relationships, understand conflict, look at different outcomes as a result. And then this weekend, or on Friday, as many of you already know, we had a law come out in Bosnia that's essentially outlawing genocide denial. And of course, that's producing pushback and will create even more conflict around what can and cannot be taught in schools. But it's countrywide now, and it's the law. So there's some glimmer of hope that that factionalization, we can start to work towards some agreement on what can be taught. Although I imagine that the conflict will increase before it gets better. Here in the United States, I think that that's one place where we could go back to looking at the examples of Cambodia and Rwanda, that we do have unifying tools for teaching history. And they're again, it's not easy. It's not without its challenges, even as they are established, but state standards do offer teachers the roadmap for how to teach our history responsibly, fact-based, truth-based. That you could look at other things besides state standards. You could look to resources that are generally regarded either at the national level by federal institutions, or across states nationally, just simply recognized as being of high quality and fact-based. So, we could look at, as I mentioned before, the guidelines at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the programs at the Smithsonian's. So if we need to be having a conversation about our ability to teach the history of race in the United States, well, the Museum for African American History and Culture has outstanding educational resources. The same could be said for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, outstanding materials that they've worked on for years to develop. The USHMM has particular lessons on propaganda under the Nazi era, and their most recent exhibition, their temporary exhibition, Some Were Neighbors, asks very, very complex questions about the gray areas of personal action. And we've found that to be a very effective tool in having difficult conversations. Library of Congress, National Archives, as I'd alluded to before, curriculum for IB programs and AP programs. These things are long established and can be a place where teachers can turn to for at least knowing that they're not going to be called out for on either in any sense for being irresponsible in their classroom teaching. And lastly, in this bill that we are here to discuss, they reference the NAEP tests, and you can go in and look at the NAEP testing and consider those guidelines as well. One of the aspects of the bill is to look more rigorously into how the NAEP test is formed and implemented. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's often referred to as the nation's report card. So that there are some that are federal, some that are recognized nationally as responsible tools. But when we think about the ways to confront the challenges that face American educators, right now, I think that sort of adherence to established institutions that are irrefutably responsible is the best practice at the moment. And that's it for me in terms of the PowerPoint, Megan. So thanks so much. And yeah, I'm again happy to answer any questions. I mean, there have been a lot of things coming up specifically in the news that I'm happy to talk about as well. But Liz, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thank you. So one of the things that, and you talked about this, but just to make this a little clearer, clearly when you're working overseas, and I did this too, when I ran education programs at the university level, you don't go in and talk about the problems that are happening in that country. Right? Because it's about critical thinking and getting people to see things from other sides. So specifically in the US, for example, and any of the programs that you're running, or how does this play out? What have you found that works, and how is this increasingly problematic when you see some laws like in Texas that would take out the requirement if it passes in Texas, they would take out requirements that you wouldn't teach, that the KKK was morally wrong, or about women's suffrage, or about civil rights. But how do you, if you're trying to create this population, so that people have critical analysis, how do you do that?
Well, it's interesting you would bring up those state-by-state cases, Liz, because there are three that come to mind. The Texas one, absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with the article that Timothy Snyder put out recently about Florida's Holocaust education requirement and how that's really in conflict. So Florida is really trying to say two things at the same time that are in conflict with one another about what should and should not be taught. I believe that, yeah, I'd sent that, if you can share that link.
Megan put it in there.
His analysis is impeccable. We're seeing something similar in Arizona, where on the same day, they signed a bill into law to mandate Holocaust education, and again, within an hour, also created a law that will fine school districts $5,000 for teaching what may be perceived as being inappropriate material concerning the history of race relations in the United States. And the impact of that, anecdotally, the impact of that has been that some districts are removing practices in diversity and equity training for teachers, removing established texts such as courageous conversations as part of their professional development out of fear for the retribution from this law. So even as we're looking at those state standards, the compliance within them can be in conflict. And I don't have a good solution for that. I think we're all in a place where we're on some new ground that we're trying to navigate. That's where the footing isn't so sure.
Yeah, because all of a sudden this work that seemed so reasonable and that everybody should get behind, you're seeing it be politicized. So what are some of those challenges, Patricia and Kate, when you're working through these programming, and how do you get people to to be champions of it. And make it clear, that there's no indoctrination. I know, Kate, I think, or Patricia, you said the other day, if we could indoctrinate students, then, I'm sorry, what were you saying? Then
it was a meme that I'd shared on Facebook
yeah.
from a teacher on Twitter who was saying, for all of you who think that we're indoctrinating students, if we could, they'd be bringing their homework in on time. They'd be showing up for class prepared. They would be arriving at school ready to work, and they'd be bringing us a cup of coffee. So, yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the challenges you're finding, and how are you able to do this work? Because if you can't get it into schools, you can't do it. So how are you able to do this?
Well, so these are great questions, and I really appreciated several things that Kate spoke about. One is, if you really want a sustainable culture of peace, teachers are an essential part of the mix. That's long been believed and known, and the numbers speak to that fact. You can exponentially expand the presence of and belief in and ability to execute peace in our communities. So that is a given. Two, I want to say, Kate used the word facts, and I tend to use the word data. So one of the things that we have found is it's really, really important in working through the frameworks that I presented and the content guides that we use to help students and teachers become very data driven. What's the data? It doesn't matter what question you're looking at, what's the data? And the only reason I hesitate to use the word facts is that's where you get into that space of whose facts. I'm just interested in data. And so we found that students and teachers are very successful in these programs and with peace education when they become present to and able to use data, actually parse through where is their violence, where is their peace, and why. I think the third thing I want to say is one of the things that you said, what are the challenges, Liz? I think one of the challenges is because the peace education conversation can be quite heated, or it has become heated. There are some assumptions sometimes that people have built in. To your point, that if you're doing peace education, there must be a point of view or an agenda that you're trying to put forward. And we have found that people are greatly relieved, communities are greatly relieved, teachers are greatly relieved, friends, family, and parents of students who are participating in peace education are greatly relieved when they really can see that it can be as much a process and a way of solving problems. In fact, more so than a narrative or a competing narrative. And I really appreciate that Kate mentioned the work she's doing in the Balkans, her work in Lebanon, her work in Rwanda, because we do work in those places too. And that is a fundamental issue, is competing narratives that prevent societies and their governments from allowing a robust narrative, allowing the intersection of narratives. Having just come back from training 100 university students in Lebanon, two of our teams are really trying to work through, because of our divisions across groups and sect, we have a difficult time reflecting on our history in the past 7 or 80 years, including a civil war that lasted 20 years. So unless we can talk about our different perspectives from 15 or 18 different views, how will we resolve this tension of the past and move forward? So I think one of the great challenges, Liz, is helping people make the transition to thinking about peace education as a process and a way of solving problems versus a particular point of view or partisan leaning or attempt to forward a particular agenda.
If I can just follow up on with a quick thought, and that is that I'm appreciating that distinction between fact and data. And that in my mind, when I think of data, I think of facts and figures and test scores and things like it. In the teacher world, I tend to think of it on that level of what information teachers are gathering to improve their skill set. When I think in that context, in the classroom context, fact I think of as something that we are working on with students constantly, the difference between fact and fiction. And so I'm appreciating your distinction of it. It's a new way for me to be thinking about it. But I also appreciate that I want to be speaking in the language that we are encouraging students to think about it. So we think about, something that's a piece of journalism, if it's claiming to be fact-based, where you're looking at all of the details and analyzing an article and things like that, looking at your sources, et cetera. The other piece that I think it's important to be thinking about that Liz had mentioned earlier is this idea of this widening of the aperture, because so much of the time when we're talking about history education or the debate about it here in the United States right now, this discussion of whether or not history is being erased, my personal feeling, speaking personally, classroom teacher personal, is that it's not the erasure of education, it's the widening of it. It's the putting things into context. It's understanding that part of the discussion, for example, about monuments needs to include, who built them and why, and when, and if you're putting everything together, that's not erasing the history, that's actually magnifying it.
Yeah, I liked what you had said at one point, opening up that aperture. And I feel like in the US specifically, but I'm sure it's like this in many other places, so much of our history has been left out. I tell the story about women's suffrage. I can't even really remember learning about it in school, but learning about the fact that, they wore these really great outfits and protested in front of the White House. What got left out is that, they were beaten, they were thrown in prison. There was the Night of Terror down in the prison in Lorton. It's the first time anybody protested in front of the White House. There's many things about it that we just weren't taught. And I think that, goes for many aspects of our history. So again, it's opening up that aperture and thinking about it in a more holistic way. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions. What about also too in the peace building education, what's critical? And I like I'm sorry, was it John Grady? Or Grady, Patricia?
Oh, Matt Grady, sorry.
Okay.
Matt Grady.
Yeah, he talked about a lot of, it came off as empathy, right? Like clearly he's in a privileged position and he's going to Brown University, but he recognizes I had lots of funding, I had the resources to take SAT scores and how do we deal with that inequality? So to me, that says a lot about empathy, and it's trying to make a change, make something better. And Chip House has a question on here. He's an educator. He's been a college professor. I'm always interested in how we get students and ourselves to integrate these concepts into their lived experiences so that they can run with them and use them on their own issues in the course of their daily lives. So I know, Patricia, that's really, it's peace through doing. Tell me some of the things that excited you, like what shocked you the most that students came up with or did. And I know we have a student from one of your programs on here, so I'd love for her to come up and talk a little bit about that as well.
All right, well, would you like to hear from Alexia first? Or
Sure.
Alexia, this is Alexia Genopoulos, who is an alum from New Gen Peacebuilders and a leader and a talent in so many ways on her own. So Alexia, rising senior near Charlotte, North Carolina, welcome.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So yeah, I'm Alexia Genopoulos, as they mentioned. I started with New Gen in 9th grade, so my entire high school experience has been influenced by New Gen. Speaking from my personal experience, after I went through the New Gen program, I've integrated it into my everyday life every second that I live, quite literally. More recently, I took a race class, understanding race at school. And through my New Gen experience, I was able to have conversations, and I was able to even teach my teachers some things that they wouldn't have known how to guide the conversation and how to have these relations. To answer your question, Chip, I think that it's usually like, as long as you get the youth excited about it, it's really a personal thing that once you teach how to make the peace project, one of my biggest takeaways from New Gen was a difference in a service project and a peace project. At this point, I've actually done 3 peace projects, and I'm in the middle of one around a very hot button issue right now, which is both mental health and immigration. So I've definitely integrated this into my life. I think as long as you teach them how to integrate it into their lives and how it is functional, rather than it's more a reference that somebody used with me the other day was teaching someone how to fish rather than giving them fish. And so when you teach someone how to fish, they'll be able to survive for the rest of their lives and they'll be able to sustain. So as long as you teach them this process and how to create a peace project and how to have these difficult conversations, they will be able to integrate it into their lives like I have. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, but can you tell us just a little bit about your project?
Absolutely. So I'm working with a group in Charlotte called Catholic Charities in conjunction with a venue called Galilee Ministries, I believe they're called. And so we're doing basically a peer-to-peer counseling because we've met with someone named Lyle. I believe my co-mentor Doyle is actually on this call, but Lyle is a minister in the area, and he was a high school immigrant. So he had the same experiences. Another thing that I've learned from New Gen is that it's really important to go directly to that group that you're wanting to service and ask them what they need, rather than imposing your own thoughts and what you think that they need. So what he told us was it was very difficult to be in a high school setting with judgmental high schoolers already. And, you don't make friends very easily, but as soon as he went in, he was being judged, he was being alienated. So he went to nursing homes, actually. And so it was a win-win for both of them. He got to practice his English skills, he got to make relationships, and the elderly at those homes got to also make relationships with this younger generation. So that's what we're aiming to do with this project. We've done things such as cake decorating just to get to know the students. And now as we're gradually getting deeper into this summer program, they're starting to open up to us as to where they come from and more of their daily struggles, which has been really interesting to watch.
So so that's wonderful. And one of the things that I was reading about recently is in schools and high schoolers are, especially with school shootings, are saying, we know who some of the vulnerable kids are and the adults can't figure it out. So we're going to start these programs where we get to know other students, identify students that we think are struggling, and trying, showing empathy and bringing people in, being more inclusive. I just thought that was fascinating that, once again, it's students trying to solve their own problems through empathy and inclusivity. Patricia.
Yeah. I know you want to ask me a question. I want to build on something really wonderful that Alexia just did there. So, she spoke about her project or her team's project. Actually, it's a team. And Alexia is very much a mentor and a leader on that team. But through this collection of data, one of the things that they learned was that their perception of who were immigrants and refugees in Metro Charlotte was completely off base. Their perception was based on what we're told in the media. What they discovered was that the largest number of recent immigrants and refugees in Metro Charlotte are Syrian and from Myanmar. Okay? And so these are real places of conflict. And so that was a learning, which then led them to have these conversations. But then what's interesting is if you take it back to your originating question, Liz, how does all of this even relate to, for instance, teaching US history?
Right.
A typical US history teacher in the United States will teach periods of time. There are blocks of time and major movements or periods that are part of the instructional standards and curriculum. If you're a US history teacher in the United States, it is highly likely that you will teach about periods of immigration in the United States, waves of immigration, what defined each one, what drove the circumstances, what it meant in terms of political and economic development. And so we find that there's a beautiful connection when teachers who can look at these periods through frameworks of conflict and peace are teaching in the classrooms, but also students like Alexia are taking that and making it come alive in terms of projects in their communities now. And what we hear over and over again is, oh my gosh, that brought history alive for me, and I was able to make it relevant today. So I think that's kind of a magic elixir. And in fact, Lexi is too modest because that team project that they're doing is having such an impact. Next summer, the two organizations she mentioned may have as many as 300 young people that they're serving next summer. And so the team is working on how would we actually serve 300 young people next summer.
Oh my. Okay. And we had talked about that also too, in terms of when you're looking at the history curriculum, again, going back and I have kids that just graduated from high school, and I've looked at their history books. They haven't changed much in a long time. We go from war to war to war. That's pretty much how I was taught history, without understanding that there were real periods of, peace, or, how did we get out of war? What, happened? It was more about, the battle deaths and anyway. So I think that, overall, there's ways that we can look at history curriculum that, from a peace building lens, that doesn't even have to be getting into, even arguing over different facts. But okay. So Courtney Cole talked about, if a primary problem with peace education in the US is a difference of opinion about what peace education should look like, what about the first step to having ongoing, difficult, but effective conversations with the powers that be about how to move together toward national peace education that suits the needs and interests of factionalized perspectives? Does that make sense?
It does. It's a fabulous question. Kate, do you want to tackle that one?
I'm just going to ask if you were interested in answering that one. It feels epic in its scale. It gets to the heart of what we're talking about. I'm going to pull it up so I can read it, because there's a lot packed in there.
There's a lot packed in there. So this difference of opinion about what peace education should
and the principles, the principles that would be taught. I mean, I think what this speaks to, Courtney, is the bigger question about what can we agree on at all. So if on peace education, on history education, finding a place where we get that, starting with that small common ground and places of agreement, and then building out would be the first natural step. But Patricia, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, one of the things I think we've learned from working with teachers across states is, some states have a very consistent approach or standards. Some states, have a very unique approach. So for instance, we had teachers working together in Alabama, North Carolina, and Vermont. And some of these are as different as night and day in terms of what the standards are, or what the teaching approach that is supported and mandated from the state agencies of education. And what was fascinating about that was, at the end of the day, when it came to peace education, it didn't matter so much. What mattered was that they all had to teach, for instance, US history, or they were all teaching AP English. And one of the things I recommend is, again, if you believe in peace education as frameworks that are processes and ways of solving problems, and you can bring data to conversations that teachers want to have, what they often say is, I'm just working on improving my craft. I want to be a master craftsman. And they come up with very creative, surprising ways to teach. So one of my favorite examples is an AP English teacher, but also we had a standards English teacher in a program where looking at what is peace and what are how do you look at the fundamental drivers of conflict and peace? How would I integrate that into what I am required to teach in the standards I must teach to in English? And they came up with creative things like, oh, I'll have my students study who were the Nobel Peace Prize winners. Why were they nominated? What did their acceptance speeches say? Were they controversial candidates? Were they not? And then be able to reason and make a well-articulated case about a Nobel Peace Prize winner that they might study. Now, it's an English class, it's a history class, it's a peace class, and it meets all the standards and requirements of teaching English that that teacher had to meet. So I think that's another thing that we really have to recognize about peace education is don't put it in one topic, in one subject. Recognize that it is relevant and can be used and applied across states when teachers get together and get facilitated to work on what they know how to do best. And then you name the subject, it can incorporate peace education.
And having had a moment now, and thank you, Patricia, because that I love that story. But I'm looking at the end of the question and seeing more the heart of what Courtney was asking. And I think the idea of is the roadmap really effective if we can't, with all these factionalized perspectives, and aren't some of the irrefutably responsible programs and tests part of what many are calling out as sources of inequity? And absolutely, that's true. I think what I'm speaking to is this moment in time. We need to improve, how we're looking at all of this, without question. But at a moment where teachers and districts have come into the crosshairs of the political zeitgeist, it's a very risky time to be asking for the ideal that we would all like to see. And in order to maintain strength, keep a steady course, not lose ground, that's what I'm suggesting at this moment, is that we look to the standards as they currently exist, and look at them creatively, as Patricia is suggesting. There's certainly plenty of room to be doing that. One of the conversations we had in preparation for this dialogue was that, particularly when we're talking about English and social studies, there's a lot of, they're both humanities, but many times you can be tackling something in an English class that you don't have the time for on a curriculum map in a social studies or history class. So you may do it through a piece of literature or a memoir, and have the time to do the character analysis, look at the conflicts within the structure of the literature and so forth, and still be meeting the skill standards of what the state standards are requiring. So I hope, Courtney, that gets to the heart of what you're asking about. I just at this moment in time, I feel like we're so fraught, and that's the reason for the dialogue, that that looking to state standards and to those irrefutably centered sources for curriculum provides a safe haven.
Yeah, I like that. Provides a safe haven. Because really what we're also talking about is critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of a lot of what we're talking about, right? It's
and especially to come back to the discussion about the word fact. It's not just fact and fiction. I think one of the core things we've got to get back to is this idea of the difference between fact and opinion. That's gotten so muddied. And it has been part of our standardized testing practice for time immemorial. But in the national dialogue, fact and opinion has become very, very blurred.
Okay, so Paul Chapman writes, how do you all feel about using different titles for what is taught? Some examples I've seen are peace and security studies, peace and conflict studies. How do you all feel about that?
One thing I would say is it is undeniable that the field of peace education or conflict resolution and peace building or peace education has grown. Kate used the word exponential earlier. I would have to say exponentially. In some ways, it feels like it's not present. In other ways, it feels like it's all around us. And so a data point that I read a couple of years ago, and I've never checked out exactly how this was determined, but a data point I read was that there are something like 400 certified peace education degrees and or certificates at the community college and university level in the United States. That's astronomical growth. And in fact, one of our alums is now getting a degree in peace, war, and defense at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so what you see is this languaging and relanguaging, and it takes many forms. And I think sometimes people think of certain things as being synonymous. The Alliance for Peacebuilding has 110 member organizations, thousands of professionals that are somehow involved in the field. And
150.
150. Sorry to cut you short.
Sorry
to jip you. But I think what's interesting about it, and my colleague Anna Patel always says this really beautifully. Look, an ecosystem has many parts to it. Think of a forest as an ecosystem, and the forest has many players and many participants, and it's a beautiful growing ecosystem. I think that's the good news. I do think what's challenging when you try to take work like this, for instance, to the high school level, is how do you actually language it in a very direct way that people can get their heads around? And I think that's one of our great challenges for the future is, I love all aspects of academia, but I think our challenge is how do we move out of that language? How do we move out of some of the ways that we describe it and presence it so it's accessible at the community level and accessible by high schools and teachers? I often go back to, and it's my last point on the subject, a point that Dr. Ian Harris used to make, and he's made so many good ones, but it was until we can actually have peace and peace education be accessible at the community level, we cannot actually establish cultures of peace. So I think that's one of our great challenges is to, and you would accuse me of this sometimes, Liz, get away from your wonkiness.
Yes. And that goes back to the practical. So what do we do about it then, right? So what more do we need? What more do we need? What more do we need to be doing? Because I don't know, for me, I've always just thought this is kind of a no-brainer. There's all that data out there that says, your soft skills are just as, even more important than your hard technical skills. And we don't teach them, or we teach programs that have no data behind them. Our bullying programs in the US are terrible. We don't, the only people that actually do it well are the Norwegians. And they actually look at data. I mean, you're talking about data. So what should we be doing? What more should we be doing?
What if we ask Alexia?
Yeah.
Alexia, what more should we be doing? You've become quite an expert on your own. What more should we be doing? Because, you're a senior in a high school and you'll be going off to university soon. What do you recommend?
So yeah, I just want to confirm your question. So you mean in matters of peace, what more should we be doing for you? In schools. Yeah, so personally, I know that without New Gen, I would have had no access to this education and I would have been completely lost. I would have never known about youth peace building. I would have never known about my impact that I could make, even though I'm a very service-oriented person. I always want to be in my community doing service projects, but I would have known nothing about this. So I think that we need to first educate our teachers and make sure that they know the importance. And I appreciate all the educators that are on here today. But I think that it's important that they all know the importance of youth peace building. And they need to know that we, as youth, we can have an impact in peace building. And also giving us a bigger seat at the table. And starting that in school. I just recently advocated for the YPS bill last week with my representative, which is Youth Peace and Security, if you don't know it. And I think—
That's international.
Yes. So I think that one of the biggest points is that we get youth excited about peace early. Because if we don't have youth at the table, then we're only going to have elders making the decisions. And if elders only make the decisions, we're only going to have peace among elders. So that's it.
Well, I would argue we don't have that either, peace among elders, but no, I agree. And also too, because it becomes this it becomes ingrained in you and it's a generational thing. It takes time, but I just, again, I'm always like shaking my head. I don't understand why this isn't just a thing. Okay, but Patricia and Kate, what more should we be doing?
Yeah,
resources. What?
Well, I'm a firm believer in community engagement. I believe that when the pandemic started, and we were seeing all of this cultural support for teachers, all of these, again, memes like, what teachers should be paying $1 million and so forth. I tell you, every teacher I know and myself, we're all like, Okay, I mean, that's nice, but as high as the people put you up on the on a pedestal, it's gonna come swinging back at you later on. So support teachers as professionals in the field, in your communities. Should support their administrations. As we're seeing right now, that in Arizona they shifted the onus of that fine from individual teachers, which I may not have said to begin with, but when it was a bill, the fine was on individual personal teachers, $5,000 for teaching, systemic racism. So support for teachers, support for administration, and support for your school boards. We saw here in Virginia, fairly recently in Loudoun County, people had to be hauled out and arrested for just this very debate. So show up in our own, be a citizen. Show up and engage in the civil process. And I know it sounds like what we're always asking people to do is to get out and speak up, but it really is the thing that's going to make a difference.
Well, and just you mentioned Loudoun County, for those that are not in Virginia, what's really critical to understand is Virginia is a pretty much bellwether state. So, and it has elections every year. You vote every year on something. And so there'll be school board elections coming up this year. And that's really what a lot of this fight is. Someone asked the question about critical race theory, the challenges and the prohibitions. And it's, one thing that is getting hit really hard here in Virginia. Virginia curriculum doesn't even teach critical race theory.
No high school or below teaches critical race theory. It's a university concept, but systemic racism, I think, is what people are speaking to.
That's right. So it goes back to what Paul Chapman was talking about, our words and how critical or how important they are. This is getting brought into a debate that isn't even, in Virginia, nobody is saying, Loudoun County wasn't saying, let's teach critical race theory. So I think that's just something important to know. Okay, so Patricia, did you answer the question? What more should we be doing?
I'm not muted, correct? I'm still with you.
Yeah, you are.
All right, good. Yeah. Well, one thing, I think this is going to surprise you, my response. One of the things is we should be using much more modern tools to actually expand and make peace education available. And what I mean by that is the conversation around peace education tends to focus on, how using the tools of the past, can we decide if those are the appropriate tools or not? Liz, that's often textbooks only. That's where often much of the debate is. But I think, Liz, you were a great reminder to us all, and certainly our students remind us all the time. They are exposed to information every day through all kinds of media. All right. And so if I often now have parents, grandparents who approach me and say, my 9-year-old grandchild or child knows about these issues and is concerned because of what surrounds them all the time. So I think one of the things that we can be doing is thinking about the use of technology to make the problem solving approaches and some of the frameworks that I'm talking about and these tools much more easily available and not so dependent on locale only, or the assumption that you can't make this education available across a broad geography. We, on September 21st, and I almost hesitate to say it because we haven't done the big reveal, but on September 21st, International Peace Day, we'll be making available a platform that actually makes it possible for teachers to adopt these frameworks and modules and tools into extracurricular experiences for service clubs and or into their classrooms. And one of the things that we found is it's not something that's put upon them. It's when local communities and teachers and superintendents decide with supporters from the community, we really want access to this. And one school that comes to mind for me in Pennsylvania has decided that not only are they going to make this content available in their school, these frameworks and tools for understanding and solving problems and looking at what their teachers are teaching, they're going to make it available in the school. They are going to give credit to every student in the school for doing this sort of peace education work. And they're actually going to carve out time during the school week and what would be, reflection blocks or study blocks to make it possible for students to use these tools. I think that is a huge, as yet untapped opportunity.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that you said that. And we were talking about it yesterday, that there's all this fight over textbooks, but you can go online and find out anything you want, right? You don't, these textbooks in some ways are a bit archaic. And I think also what I think was really fascinating is when COVID hit, I remember you and I talking about this, how your program expanded because it could go anywhere and everywhere, and it wasn't hindered by, location. People had access, so it makes perfect sense that and again, when you were talking, I was just thinking about it. Yeah, kind of been banging our heads, to get into that brick and mortar, but you don't have to now, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we have to be respectful of school systems and be respectful of teachers and be respectful of the standards that Kate was talking about, and absolutely honor that, and we should be using the tools to spread these notions of peace education, because those tools are being used to spread a lot of things that are the opposite of peace education. One of the things, the experiences we take students through is looking at how over the past 20 years, the media you use and choose is in some ways defined for you. And you don't even realize it as a young person. You think you really stand for equality and equality and openness and transparency and so on. But if you're only in the same channels, the same media over and over again, that gets in the way of you actually being a peace builder too. And so I think we have to recognize that we have to use technology to reinforce these ideas and principles and ways of thinking about being a good citizen.
Well, and the other way, but one important thing is also, how do you bring people together from different perspectives and different areas? I think that's really important, Kate.
And going back for a moment to what Patricia just said, you could see me, I was looking on my phone because, my mind went blank on what was it, the law that changed in the 80s under Reagan, and it's the fairness doctrine.
That's
and
right.
the internet has not even begun to keep up with that. And again, I'm speaking personally here, not in my capacity as the lead of an organization, but when the loss of the fairness doctrine, we're seeing it writ large now in this discussion again of fact versus opinion, when news reports, whatever channel you're turning on, are essentially editorials. How is anybody supposed to discern? And I'm really loving this discussion about facts and data, and I'm going to dig deep into this after we get off, because I think there's a lot there. But we need to get back to owning the word facts. Fact, that needs to be something facts need to be something as a concept that we can rely on. So yeah, I would love to go back and revisit the fairness doctrine and how it might reasonably be re-implemented in the times we live in. And I realize that that's way out of my wheelhouse, and I'm speaking purely, on the fringes of it. But I know the impact that it had. I could watch it over time in the classroom, how further and further away we got from acknowledging, what news can you watch that's going to actually, not just be like, and this is across the spectrum, is not essentially going to be editorializing.
So just so people know what the fairness doctrine was.
Thank you. Yes.
In the Ronald Reagan, it got rid of it during that period of time. But essentially what it was is the news was the news. And if it was editorialized, you had to have a counter opinion on it. So that's essentially what it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And having grown up my education occurs prior to that ending, and then watching what's happened since then and how difficult it is to make this distinction between fact and opinion. I'm sure that's a contributing factor. But you'd asked another question, Liz, and I lost the thread.
I think, what more should we be doing? Like, what, if you want to talk about policy, like what are 3 things we should be doing?
3 things we should be doing. Okay.
So I'm just throwing it out there, 3 things.
So I think I've named 2. Let's
Okay.
let's reclaim the concept of facts,
Yeah.
and let's look at how that's permeated throughout our culture. That gray area of fact versus editorial or opinion, of getting engaged with community-based government, community news, just showing up, because I admire the people who make the time in their day to go and be a school board member. It's not a small ask to take time out of your personal family life or whatever you might be doing for your own self-care and restoration or health, to go and sit in a board meeting, a couple times a month and have people, I think Leslie Knope said, I hear people caring very loudly at me, right? And the original in Parks and Rec, then the television series, where they have the civic meetings and people are constantly yelling at her about their opinions. We ask our fellow citizens to show up and do that. And I think as much as we are able to go and support those people in that work is vital to this process of peace building and reconstructing our culture. Lexia is seeing that as an active student right now, and I hope that's contagious.
So Alexia, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there anything? What would you, that we have this Youth Peace and Security International bill? Should we be doing one here in the U.S.? And what should be in it? Should it be funding of peace building education? What are a couple of things that you would want to see in there?
Yeah, so actually there is a new YPS bill coming out soon, hopefully in the next few weeks, that will be reintroduced into the Congressional House. In that, there will be a funding number attached, but the main goal of that is really to get youth excited about peace. It's to help head up more peace coalitions and youth peace coalitions. So I'm hoping from out of that, we're going to just educate more broadly to everyone, parents, students, that this is a thing, youth peace building is a thing, and that you have the power to build peace in your own community.
But in order to do it, as I always say, you have to have resources and people have to have access to it. And I think that's what Patricia is talking about too, is that how, how New Gen Peace Builders has been able to get into schools and overcome some of the challenges of time and, being a little nervous about what are they going to be teaching, and seeing the benefit of what can happen with a lot of these projects. I know you guys are all being shy because along the way, talking with Patricia about the work that's happening. I know during COVID, one of the projects that happened in Charlotte, was it Charlotte, North Carolina, or Charlottesville, Virginia, about getting the word out on COVID to immigrant communities, that sort of thing. I mean, I could go on and on and on about these incredible projects that have happened. So you guys are all being very shy.
Yeah, well, actually, to give credit where credit's due, that's happened a lot because people are concerned about it. But a really amazing project was in Birmingham, Alabama. Oh,
it was Birmingham. Okay, that's where it was. Okay, well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite subjects. I love hearing about the peace projects that are happening. I love, making sure that this work gets into schools. It seems it's super easy overseas. We've struggled here at home. And, these are 2 projects that have been able to work in the schools in a way that is bipartisan, that, is trying to address some of, whether it's the symptom or the conflict driver, and push back, and then do incredible work along the way, not just learning about peace building, but actually putting it into doing. So I want to thank you because, as conflict dynamics in the US increase, this is critical. And I just want to thank you all. And thank you, Lexi. You were awesome. Thank